but we should be ready to go.
And welcome back to Sets and Reps podcast. I'm Dr. Michael Landrum here with Travis Erickson once again. This week we're going to flip around what we did last week, and Travis is going to present a series of experiments to me on, I believe, motor learning and control.
I told you just the bare essentials. I didn't kind of reveal anything, and so I just want to preface everything here. So I'm not a motor learning or motor control specialist by any means. I had a couple of graduate classes in it. I've always felt it was very interesting. It's kind of it's sort of the redheaded stepchild, if you will, of exercise science. A lot of exercise science programs do not have motor learning, motor control components in their curriculum, but it definitely is part of that. Same thing with sport nutrition or sports psychology. Those are definitely parts of it.
Yes, I know in undergrad I had both the motor learning and control and sports psychology, two classes that maybe at the time I didn't appreciate as much as I did, but after going to other schools and not having any exposure to that, I realized how valuable that was to just understanding sport and exercise science overall.
Well, the thing I liked about motor learning and motor control the best was the idea that it pertained to me as a coach, because that's really what I wanted to do. As I was in grad school, I was strength coach and also helping coach the track and field teams, and a lot of the principles that I learned in those classes, I felt that I could directly apply to what I was doing. It helped me better understand how to give instruction and how to interpret feedback and things of that nature. And so what I've done is I've drawn upon three, I don't want to say they're like landmark studies, but I kind of went through some of my old textbooks that I had when I was in grad school and pulled out a few that, Michael, you may or may not remember. Certainly I had to jog my memory as well on some of these things, but I thought what I could do is kind of give you the basics of the study, and then see if you can, I guess, predict a little bit about what the results were, and then we can talk about the actual results, and then I thought we could kind of throw back and forth some of the ways that we could apply this to coaching either in the weight room or outside of the weight room and that sort of thing. And so the first one I actually have for you actually plays a little bit back to our idea of the placebo effect last week. The idea that you sort of can trick people to some degree and kind of force them to do better or worse depending upon the feedback you give them, even if it may not be based in reality. Right? And so it's called the inverted U principle. Does that ring a bell at all to you?
I've heard of a lot of different inverted U's from either like cardiac health and testosterone or the open window theory for immunosurveillance and things like that. There's a lot of them, but maybe you need to be a little more specific.
So this one is based upon a study by Weinberg and Reagan back in 1978. And so it has to do with optimal arousal levels to create optimal performances. And so what they did in their study was that they had a group of college males and they had them practice. They took 10 repetitions of throwing a tennis ball at a small 5 centimeter target that was 6.1 meters away. And so they took and they threw 10 tennis balls at this target, and then they were given one of three types of feedback, and the feedback they were given was randomized. So it wasn't based upon how they actually performed. It was completely random on stuff. And so what they did is they tried to give them three forms of feedback that were designed to elicit three different levels of stress. So in the high stress condition, the subjects were told that 90% of the population of college males would have performed better. And so they were told they did very poor compared to other college males. The moderate stress then was told that 60% would have done better than what they did. And then the low stress we're told that only 30% of people would have done better than that. In addition, then they were told that performance on this test is highly correlated with essentially it was an indicator of success in most sport tasks that involve throwing, even though that's not really true necessarily. So they were told that's like how well you do on this really will indicate some degree of athleticism for throwing types of sports. And so the question for you then is so then they went back and after they were given that feedback, the high stress, moderate stress, or low stress feedback, how do you suppose they performed?
Well, I guess since we started out with that inverted U, I would imagine that middle group, the 60%, ended up performing the best after that, whereas the 90%, maybe they started to get their emotions involved a little bit too much, lost some control that way, rushed themselves, or got too hard on themselves if they noticed that they were missing. I guess they weren't blindfolded or anything.
No. They were just, and again, I think what's the important thing to kind of keep in mind with the study is I understand it was that, let's say, in those 10 trials, you hit the target 7 times, which might be good. But you still might be told that 90% of people would do better than that. And so it had no real bearing upon how you actually did. You were just told that.
So you could feel like you're doing really well, like, you could.
Right, but then the research would say, nope, that's terrible.
Yeah.
Or you might be like, man, I only hit the target 2 times. But they might come back and say that, no, that's better than. Only 30% of people will do better than that. So you might be like, oh, I actually did really well. So that's kind of like I said, it kind of ties back to what we talked about last time about the idea of this placebo effect, that you're kind of lying to these people, right?
Yeah.
And so, but they're believing it, and in addition, they're believing that how well they do in this particular test is an indicator of how well they could play baseball or other kind of throwing sorts of tasks.
Okay. So I'd imagine background does have a lot to do with this, where if you knew that you used to be quite the high school athlete or whatever, then maybe that influences it more. But otherwise, I'll go with saying that the middle group probably improved the most, the lowest group after that, and then saying 90% of people were better than you probably had the least amount of improvement.
You're correct. And so in this case, so what they were looking at was these stress conditions produce a certain level of arousal for the person. Like in a low stress condition, you're thinking, oh, I'm doing pretty good. And so your arousal level is quite low. And so in those cases, those people actually did not perform particularly well when they did the actual test.
Okay.
And then the same thing was true on the high stress condition. They were over aroused. They were like, man, I got to do a lot better because I'm really sucking at this task, essentially. So they put too much pressure on themselves, and then they themselves did not do particularly well either. Although that group did better than of the 3 groups, the low stress condition did the worst.
Okay.
The high stress condition did better than them, but not as good as, like you said,
as the
inverted U is the idea that it's kind of the Goldilocks, right? It's like it's not just right, essentially. And so that group then performed the best when they did the trial a second time.
Interesting. That was pretty telling, I guess. So you can kind of mislead people a little bit into getting them to perform a little bit better just by throwing numbers at them.
Right. So. But it's like you said, I mean, and so this inverted U hypothesis has been studied and kind of reevaluated and tweaked over the years. And one of the things that you brought up is very telling, because it's not going to be linear. It's not every single person is going to respond the same way, because you're right. There might be some people that just they need to be told that they're really bad in order to do really well. Whereas other people, they need to be coddled and be like, oh, you're doing fine, even if they're not really doing fine.
Right.
They need to be told they're doing pretty good in order to do. So everyone has their own individual optimal arousal level. Yeah. And that's, I think, the interesting part about this study and kind of how it's been interpreted in years since then is that it's not a hard and fast rule. Because arousal means different things to different people.
Yeah, and what gets you to that state has got to be different also, whether it's intrinsic motivation, extrinsic, because, I know there's a lot of people that it's, all about some extrinsic rewards is what's driving me to this.
Yep.
Other people, it's, much more intrinsic.
Yeah. And there's also this idea that what they call the catastrophe hypothesis, which is the idea that at a certain point for every person, when their arousal reaches a certain level, and it's dependent upon that individual, when it gets to that certain level, performance drops off dramatically. So it's not a linear kind of relationship. It's not like, a little bit of stress, I do a little bit better. A little bit more stress, I do a little bit better. A lot more stress, but then with the catastrophe hypothesis, it says that when you get to a certain arousal level, performance goes to hell. Essentially, is that it just gets really bad. And so this kind of plays into the idea of, you're in a championship game situation, and the coach is going to talk to the team ahead of time. They're already in a high state of arousal because they know what's on the line in this game. And so one of the worst things that a coach can do is to overly arouse that group and be like, we got to win this game and blah, 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 right? And they come
really
out
hyped.
They get overhyped and they play and perform very, very poorly. And so in some cases, those athletes they're in that locker room before the game starts, and they're overly aroused. Means that coach actually has to bring them down a little bit.
I could see that, because I could especially see that on like really winning teams that have a lineage of or a dynasty, whatever we call them in high school. I'm not sure if we have dynasties in high school, but they know that we're third year or 3-year state champs. This is our 4th year, senior year for a lot of people, and here's the game that we've got to make it. So that's already a lot of pressure on them, getting them aroused.
But it can go one of two ways, because you can also have these teams that they rest in their laurels too much. Oh, we're great. They're essentially their arousal level is too low. They don't feel stressed enough because they feel that they're top of the game.
Right, their feeder program is outstanding, so they know they have the talent. They've been developing and cultivating the team that they need to win the championship. So we can send out second string and take care of anybody in our conference. It's not till we get to sectionals or state that we actually have to worry about sending first stringers.
So I was going to ask you then, so what do you think that, based upon this discussion that we've just had, how would you apply this to, I guess, a specific weight room scenario, like let's say you're working with an athlete, how could you maybe use this concept to influence how you would coach that person?
It's an interesting question because there's some of it where with weight training and all that, you may not want to stress them overly much because whether they're in season or out, then you might actually be doing them some harm by causing too much damage, too much neurological fatigue or anything like that, just because, especially for our student athletes we have here, they might have other tasks, duties, and responsibilities that they're responsible for.
I'm thinking a little bit in terms of the feedback. Like we were just working out earlier, and we had a student come in. He's learned how to do some Olympic lifts, and I think in his case, we tend to be very nurturing with him, and we try to really encourage him. And I think a different athlete might be different in the weight room. Like you might need to be more critical with that person, right? And so it's kind of how you get to know that person and figure out what seems to work best for them.
Yeah, I'll agree. Because I always came up in a high-success environment. That's what you always want to do because, like we were talking about, it can get in your head a little bit, see the color change on the plates, and then it's not really any different than when you just had, the green 10 and the 5 on there. But now when you go up to the 15, you're just like, oh, that yellow, that's a little bit too much, making me turn yellow.
Well, the guy that was working out today made the comments like he likes working with the kilo plates because he doesn't really know how much weight it is.
Yeah.
And if he were to know specifically, it's like, hey, this is a good amount of weight you're lifting compared to others at your age, or this is a low amount of weight, that might influence his performance.
Yeah. Well, I guess one way I see this being used, maybe even without people thinking about it, is having record boards on the wall in weight rooms where you see how you compare to the best, and some of them might be in your year, or at least while you're at that school. So you can see how you stack up against the competition. I remember in our weight training classes in high school, when we would have our monthly testing, we would post that outside the weight room door. Everybody in every weight training class, junior, senior, here's what your max was, here's what it is after this testing. So you could see it for everyone. So that was really, it was either encouraging to people, I think. It was encouraging to me, to see that and see how you can move up and how you compete against people from other sports. As a cross-country runner and, lightweight wrestler, it was, nice to see me being able to kind of hold my own against some people. And
I think what goes along with this is the idea, the same thing in this research study. I think a key component of it was this idea that it wasn't just that the participants were told that 90% did better or 60%, but it was the idea that performance in that task relates to future performance. And so there's certain lifts in the weight room that were like, hey, if you're good at the power clean, you're going to be a good sprinter, for example, whereas bench press doesn't really apply as directly. And so I think the importance that we play on a specific lift or whatever drill we want to do for our sport, but those specific messages that we give to our athletes can really help them can put them in a specific state of arousal.
I think that's entirely accurate, where if you can associate a specific exercise or type of warm-up or with success, with athletic success in their chosen event, then all the better. I mean, just look at how many people squat for Olympic weightlifting. I mean, I'm not to say that there's a better way to do it, but it's just people do it without even thinking about it, because that you increase that squat, you're increasing your other lifts too. So it's just taken as gospel
I think
truth.
And it kind of plays into the idea where it's like your team has to have an identity that you're working with, and they have to believe, there have to be certain truths that team has to buy into. And so it's like if they believe that your 10-meter sprint time is critical, then when you go and test that, they're going to work harder to try to achieve that. Whereas if they know that, or if you've got certain people on the team that's like, it's like the combine, for example, or for the NFL. It's like we look at something like the 225 for reps. It's like it doesn't really correlate to anything, and so who's really going to try hard on that? Whereas 40-yard dash, people get really up about that because they, for right or wrong, they might believe that those numbers really mean a lot.
Yeah, that's true.
And so I think that's an important concept to kind of throw along with this too.
Yeah, I agree. And that can really explain why you see certain things making sense in certain programs or not at all. Like maybe upright rows for time isn't the best idea.
It's a bad that would not be good. But if for some reason you could convince your team that was important.
Well, I've seen some programs where apparently they have convinced their team that that's
questionable
important.
Lifts.
Well, I don't think football players need shoulders or anything like that, if I remember how the sport works. So...
Well, let's transition to another experience. That was one I thought you might really enjoy here. All right, Michael, the next one I want to transition into is what's known as Henry Rogers' experiment.
Okay.
Does that ring a bell at all?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, so this was a 1960 study in which they looked at simple reaction time.
Okay.
Now, do you know what simple reaction time is versus like a choice reaction time is?
Is it just like tapping a space bar a number of times, or?
Well, so simple means there's no decision. So basically, you're given a stimulus and then you respond to it.
Okay.
So there's no, you're not trying to measure how quickly they can make a decision. It's just based upon, I give you a stimulus and you respond to it. Whereas choice is, for example, you might measure choice. Like, say I have my left finger and my right finger on a space bar. And if I see a green light, I lift my right finger. If I see a different color light, I lift my left finger. So a simple reaction time is just you give a stimulus.
Wherever a light comes on, then you hit button.
Right. But now what they did with this study was that they had a stimulus, and so it's sort of another example of where you're measuring two different variables, but you don't tell the subjects what you're specifically trying to measure.
Okay.
And so what they did was they had all the subjects had their finger on a button, and then they were given a stimulus, and the stimulus was always the same. But they were told ahead of time that they're either going to respond by just lifting their finger off the button, or they would have a slightly more complex task. And so the intermediate complexity task was they would lift their finger off the button, and then they would grasp a ball that was hanging from a string. And then return and touch the button again. And then the more advanced complexity task was they would lift their finger off the button, and they would hit the ball with the back of their hand, touch another button, and then come back and touch and hit the ball again. And so essentially each task, so it was simple.
Added a layer of complication
exactly.
to it.
So the question for you then is, so the researchers measured both the reaction time, which would be how long after the light buzzed did I lift my finger off the button. And they also measured movement time, so for those three different tasks. So obviously for the movement time for the most basic complexity task is zero.
There is much lower.
There's no movement. It's basically I lift my finger off the button, the task is over. So the question for you then, Michael, is how do you suppose their simple reaction time changed in relation to the complexity of the task that they had to perform?
Well, I would obviously, I guess, think somewhere in the middle road right there, where as you add more and more to it, you have the increased probability of confusing the sequence that you should. I mean, it sounds like it's basically just adding another layer of touch the ball, touch the button, touch the ball, touch the button, back and forth. So after a while, it's just, repetition. It's just how quickly you can go back and forth between them. But then, of course, after time, that can get confusing because of how many rounds you have to do, counting them up. 1, 2, 3. I've lost count on a set of 3 for front squats before. I'm sure that people, moving their hands around are able to do the same thing. So in that case, I'll go with the middle one, where you just have to pick your hand up once. That's going to improve. That's
going to have the shortest reaction time, you think? So again, so just to clarify, so the way this worked is, so the subjects were told in advance what response they would have to make once the light went off. And so in the, like I said, in the most basic example, it was the light goes off, all you have to do is lift your finger. And then we're just going to do 20 trials of that, for example. And they know ahead of time. They're not choosing. It's not like, red light, blue light, whatever.
Now, are we looking at how much of improvement was actually gained?
It's looking at what is the mean reaction time.
Then I guess the shortest one would have to be the best, then, because there's as little movement as possible. As little movement as possible.
That's right. That's right. And so basically, the basic results of this research study indicate that the more complex the task is that you have to perform, the longer your reaction time is to initiate that task.
Just to start the task. I see what you're saying now. Okay, very interesting.
And so what this plays into is the idea of a motor program. Is that a very, very simple motor program. I program it in my head, and I know that when the light goes off, all I have to do is lift my finger. That's easy. So you can make that motor program very, very quickly. But when the motor program becomes a little bit more complex, it takes more time to put it into your brain's process. So even though all you're measuring is how long it takes them to lift their finger off the button, when the task becomes lift my finger off the button and now touch the ball, or lift my finger off the button, hit the ball, touch a button, hit the ball again.
I see what you're talking about.
It makes the reaction time longer and longer and longer.
Okay, just to initiate it off the button.
Just to initiate it, exactly.
Interesting. That's pretty fascinating. That is. It is. I guess you have to kind of lead into a little bit for whatever your next move is going to be, so that slows you down off your first move.
Right. So when I first learned about this concept, I was coaching track and field, I immediately thought of the start in track and field. Like you're in the starting blocks, and if I am very, very proficient with my track start, that motor program is pretty well established because I've practiced it hundreds of times, like driving up out of the blocks. I'm not thinking about each individual element that I have to do, like drive my right arm forward, left arm drives back, and keep my head down. I'm not thinking about those things because it's all autonomous, essentially. And so when that gun fires, if I'm very proficient with that start, then I should have a shorter reaction time than a person that's just learning how to do a track and field start.
And or thinking about those next things. Okay, after I push off with this back leg, then it's bring this next one forward.
Exactly.
Or lengthen the stride, and then really open up in the back 50.
So what do you think? How would you apply this, or how would you see how this may apply to maybe a strength training environment?
Interesting. Well, I guess it's decreasing the complexity of your exercises. So especially if you're trying to do some sort of high power movement, then you're not going to want to make it into this huge complex where you've got this exercise and the next exercise and the next one. Because whether or not you start sandbagging in the beginning just to save some for later, or it's just it slows you down because you start thinking about it. As well, the type of movement that you pick, whether it's pick Olympic weightlifting, whether it's the full lift or just a segment of it, then you might pick one over the other just to decrease the complexity, get you to start firing those muscles and moving under the bar, moving around it, whatever it is you're trying to work on.
That's how I kind of think of it. Is that we don't think about reaction time in the weight room. We're not really. It's not like someone's saying, "Oh, set, go, do your clean," or whatever. But it has to play into the idea of sequencing. Like timing in an Olympic lift, for example, is very important. And so how I transition from my first pull into the scoop and into the second pull and into my catch or whatever. Small variations in my sequencing or the timing of that movement can really lead to a missed lift, for example, right? And so if you think about a beginner learning how to do a clean, all those individual movements are very complex. And in fact, if you see a lot of younger lifters, it looks very mechanical, right? Whereas a more proficient lifter is like, it's one smooth movement, essentially, right? They've sequenced and timed things out. So I think I love this research study because it's hard to grasp kind of what they were actually looking at because like I said, they're kind of tricking the participants. But
I think the end or the take-home message of it is that you kind of want to keep things simple.
Yeah.
Stupid.
Right.
So,
or if it is a complex task, the more practiced you become at it, I would suspect that it becomes a simpler task for you.
I could definitely see that. And maybe that's the benefit of breaking something that's complex into smaller units. I mean, same thing with writing papers. Most people don't just sit down and write the whole thing through. You work on different sections.
But it plays that whole idea of like whole practice versus part practice is that you might get really good at those parts, but when you put them together as a whole, it might fall apart.
Yeah, we definitely see that. You go to a local weightlifting meet and you see a lot of people pull to the knee, hitch as they go into like they're doing from like the hang from practice, and then they pull under, and then there's hitching, stopping, all that sort of thing. So you could definitely see that sort of thing. So probably the combination of both, or whenever it's appropriate to transition them into it. So
the last thing I'll say on this is that other research studies that have come up past or since then have looked at not so much. Because this Henry Rogers experiment looked at the complexity of the task.
Okay.
But subsequent research have looked at not only is it the complexity of the task, but the duration of the task.
Oh, okay.
Can also influence how long that simple reaction time is. So if it's something that's going to take me a long time to do, even if it's not hard, just the fact that it's longer might also increase that reaction time because that motor program is being built to indicate that it's going to take a longer period of time to complete the task. And so that could also play into lifting movements, perhaps, as well. As like longer movements might be harder to assemble,
sprinting or anything like that, because you have to continuously think about your turnover, especially if you're getting ready to hand it off, like in a relay. That's a whole added level of complexity at the very end of it. That's that's way down the line that you've got to think about, but it's in your mind because you got to time that perfectly. So long as you aren't doing like mile relays, that's a little bit easier. But 100-meter dash relay, I mean, you got to have that thing timed down for stick.
Exactly. Or hurdles. You look at your time with the lead leg and things like that. Yep, exactly. So, all right, this next study, Michael, is known as Hicks' Law. Have you heard of Hicks' Law?
I feel like I have heard of that, but I can't quite place it. Refresh my memory, please.
Okay, so this was Hicks' Law came out, but it's actually in relation to a very old study done by Merkel, which is back in the 1800s. And so this was not looking at. The last study we talked about was looking at simple reaction time. This is looking at choice reaction time. And so in Merkel's classic study, what they did was they they numbered the digits on your right hand with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Okay.
And then on your left hand, it was Roman numeral 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Mm-hmm.
And what they would do in this study was that they were looking at, they were told in advance that they were going to have to perform a sequence. So they were going to be given a stimulus that was going to make them choose which finger to lift. And so, but they were told in advance, it's like, okay, I'm going to give you a stimulus, and I'm going to have you lift digit number 1. Okay. And so that's not even a choice, right? It's just a simple reaction time. Yeah. But they might have been told a slightly more complex would be like, okay, it's going to be either digit number 1 on your right hand or Roman numeral number 1 on your left hand. Okay. And so when the light fires, or you're going to be told, one of those two options is how you're going to have to respond.
So do you think, were they telling them to say like Arabic numeral 1, Roman numeral 1?
Something like that, yes. That's how, I don't know exactly, but I would assume it was something like that. Yeah. Or they were maybe flashed a card that told them.
I gotcha.
So they had to choose, they were only going to lift one finger, for example, but they were told in advance how complex the task was going to be. You're going to have to choose between 2 fingers. Okay. Or you're going to have to choose between 3 fingers or 4 fingers. So obviously the most complex it could become would be you have to pick from 10 different fingers, right? So they were told in advance how complex it would be. And so the question for you then is how do you suppose the number of alternative options they were given, or the number of choices they were given, would influence their reaction time?
Say the more that you have, the longer it's going to take them to react. But I'd say for the first couple, after 2, I might even go say as much as 4 fingers, and it's not going to be as much of a problem. But it depends on which ones you pick because of the muscles that are going to move those fingers. So if you're picking some of these, here where it's your extensor digitorum communis, then it's a little bit more difficult to, I guess, isolate those and move them independently. As
so now I don't know exactly. I mean, I don't know the specifics of the study if they had to specifically move that finger
or just wiggle it a little bit.
I think the idea was that they, like you said initially, it was the idea of they did.
They wouldn't like me as a reviewer, I guess, on this. So,
well, it's like they had to pick between either 2 fingers or pick between 3 fingers or 4 fingers or 5 fingers, or eventually pick up to 10 fingers they had to pick from.
I gotcha. I'll say that the less fingers the better, but I'll say I wouldn't be surprised if there was like a threshold there where after a certain point, then it becomes markedly more difficult. But beforehand, not really significantly different.
Okay, so you're right. And so what they were looking at, and so this is Hicks' law, and so Hicks' law is stated as choice reaction time is linearly related to the log of the number of stimulus alternatives. For example, the reaction time increases, in this case, it increased by about 150 milliseconds every time the number of stimulus response alternatives double.
Oh, okay.
So from 1 to 2, it would increase, or from 1 to 2 alternatives, it would increase by 150 milliseconds, but then for it to increase by another 150 milliseconds, you'd have to go from 2 to 4. And then 4 to 8, essentially. And so that's what that looked at, right?
So, there would be right about, that's pretty close there, huh?
Yeah, you're pretty good on that one.
Not bad.
Exactly. So, again, this is a weird study. I don't know how well we can maybe make this apply to. But I think in some cases, if we do agility testing, for example, or even sport performance, if I'm running straight ahead and I'm told either cut to my left or cut to my right, there's 2 choices. But if I give someone, and so they run to a certain spot and then the coach points left or points right or whistles or doesn't whistle or whatever, they're going to choose one direction or the other. So it becomes a choice reaction as opposed to a simple reaction where it's like, okay, run to the cone and then
turn right,
right? Yeah. But then you could also add complexity where it's like, okay, you're going to go to your left, go to your right, or you're going to backpedal, or you're going to continue to run forwards, essentially. Yep. And so I think it's interesting to apply it in that perspective, I think.
Yeah, and then just add another layer if somebody's throwing the ball at you, or you're trying to block a tackling dummy or whatever else it is. It just adds another layer to it. And although it may not be a distinct, adding 2 more, 4 more to there, but maybe it's a difference of that from you're not running anymore to now you're catching, to you're blocking, you're doing something else. So maybe that increased complexity kind of changes that curve a little, so you may not need to double it, but adding something much more complicated, like in lacrosse, catching a ball behind your back as you're running forward. It's a skill that you really teach from the beginning on, because that's pretty critical to overall success. But that's definitely complicated, especially with people in the beginning, where it is a lot of stopping, looking, catching, and then going again. But you do that in a game, you're going to get clocked. So
Well, it was interesting in the research side. They talk about the fact that with just one alternative, it's about, let's say, 200 milliseconds response time. But when you get up to 10 alternatives, that response time can get up to 600 milliseconds. That's a pretty long amount of time to process and make a decision. And the comparison they give here then is, so again, 10 alternatives represents about 600 milliseconds of reaction time. The comparison they give then is that if you're a batter in baseball, the amount of time it takes for the ball to come from the pitcher to you as a batter is about 460 milliseconds. And so if you think about it's like if I'm going against a pitcher that I know only pitches 2 pitches or whatever, then I don't have a lot. I can make my decision much later in the process and still make contact with the ball. Whereas if I'm going against a pitcher that has 10 different pitches in terms of location or slider, curveball, fastball, whatever, it makes it harder for me to select my response based upon my observation of what's going on with that pitch. Yeah,
because for some of those, they look so similar where you do start to create spin on the ball, but you may not be able to track exactly what the speed of the spin is, how strong that Magnus effect is going to be.
There you go, right.
There's some biomechanics there for you.
But you look at, I think some of the best pitchers, they are able to disguise that pitch all the way through their delivery. Whereas in some pitchers, you kind of can pick up some cues. Like it's like, oh, they're tipping their elbow or shoulder or whatever. So I know it's going to be
turning their body so that way they can
so right away I know what it's going to be, and so I've got essentially, because I picked up what pitch it was, I have a longer period of time to kind of select my choice. Whereas if I can't pick up that ball soon enough, I can't program a choice quick enough to respond. Or I pick something. Well, I'm just going to swing here. I'm going to hope the ball is there. Right?
Yeah, because that might be all it is in some cases.
Exactly.
So there's enough of them that look similar enough that are going to be around that area that just go for it. You might ground it into the ground or ground it in or whatever, but it's give you a better chance than just staring at it. So, interesting.
Well, I thought you might enjoy some of these. I mean, like I said, motor learning, motor control is definitely an area that's included in exercise science, but it's oftentimes neglected in the curriculum. And so I would recommend that, particularly for those people that want to go into coaching, learning a little bit about some of these basic kinds of concepts can really make a big contribution to how you coach and give feedback and that sort of thing.
Yeah, because you might be overloading your athletes with all kinds of information about maybe you do a multifaceted approach, not just train, but you try and do a little nutrition, try and do a little bit of lifestyle, about, get your sleep, eat your vitamins, all that sort of thing.
It's too much stuff to process.
Especially when you got other stuff like school and work and family going on.
Right, and a lot of our coaching work involves working on technique, and we've talked about this a lot when we've worked out. It's like, what feedback am I going to give? And because if you start giving too much feedback, the movement slows down, and if it's a power-based movement, they're not going to be successful anymore.
You can't think about fixing 6 things in a movement that only lasts 1.5 seconds. That's not nearly enough time.
And I think the interesting thing about these particular studies, it's not so much the fact that maybe I can't perform the skill because I've been given too much feedback, but maybe it's I'm given too much feedback, and so now all of a sudden the sequencing or the timing of my movement is disrupted. So I'm still, like we look at like a clean or a deadlift, it's like, well, don't round your back. Well, that's an obvious thing, right? But they might not be rounding their back, but their timing is thrown off somewhere because I've given them too much feedback. And so visually, it looks right. I don't see any wrong movement patterns. But something seems off because they're just not timing stuff out correctly.
And making sure you pick the right cue to give is also important. Why are they rounding their back in the first place? Is it just upper back weakness? Or are they starting with the bar, 6 inches out in front of them, so they're essentially just doing a Romanian deadlift instead, and being able to figure out that step closer to the bar, get right up against you. So
and this really plays into the idea of the physiological feedback and the neurological feedback, and as a coach, you've got to consider both of those things. Because it's like, well, we know you don't want the bar out in front of you because physiologically that's going to mess you up. Biomechanically, that's a problem. But looking deeper into this, like, oh, mechanically everything looks correct, but the timing seems wrong. There's something there's a barrier with the firing of those neurons. Something's not quite right with this movement. So do I do like you suggest? Do I break it down to a more simplistic movement to work on that one problem? how do I address that? And that's where the art of coaching kind of comes in.
I think so, because you might find that we're doing, I guess, deadlifts off blocks today.
Right.
So, I picked a different height today than I did the last time I did this, because I wanted to work through that movement a little bit differently.
Sure.
So instead of starting above the knee, it was below the knee, so I have to work on that transition.
Yep.
Slows it down a little bit, but after, a few weeks of practice,
and you put the whole thing together.
It's going to get a little bit smoother there.
Right.
Yep. So, I think that's a good way to be able to really emphasize those things, but it's picking the right exercises, of course. How to correct those, it may not always be, just do it from the hang, do it from wherever. It's, maybe we need to move it by a couple inches there, so we have to think about that extra little bit.
Right.
That's where you get the crossover from the floor, and now...
It's kind of what we've been saying all along. It's like there needs to be a method to your madness. You don't just pick random things and put it in a workout because you read about it online. It's like you're trying to work towards something. We had that conversation today with the lifter that came in. It's like, where does this block of training fall into your life?
Yeah, exactly.
In your 30-year, 40-year plan of lifting weights, where is this 1 week gonna be in there?
Yeah, exactly. I think we were talking about that just because some people just try and do too much so fast, and they don't realize that a 5-week program where I'm trying to focus on this one area is a drop in the bucket for this year alone, if not just the next 10 years of training. But if you can fix that problem now, just think of the improvement that you can make later on, because now it's not an issue. You aren't hitching, you aren't doing whatever the issue is.
And I think it's an appropriate kind of conversation to have right now, particularly since we're in a win now, we're in a immediate we want immediately to get better. It's like, it doesn't always work that way.
Nope.
Especially
the better you get.
We need to learn some patience in the process to make sure that we're not grooving a bad habit just to kind of temporarily win.
Yeah, I'll agree with that entirely. So I've seen a lot of people who, I guess, throwback to people who kind of might be naturally strong, just walk by a weight stack and get bigger from it. But maybe they don't work on all of that nuance as much. I can muscle through the activities. Of course, not everybody's like that. But, you've got the brute strength. There's just the body weight to throw against something that, I can let it slip a little bit here and there. But if they were to, refine whatever that one little thing is, the biggest piece that's throwing them off, maybe that's a 50-pound gain this month instead of a 20-pound off this program, because you're still losing a little bit. You got too much torque being put on your hips, not enough somewhere else, or vice versa. And I can see that being a real big impact for a lot of people, just taking that long-term approach from it. So obviously it's not a marathon by means we're talking about weight training, but it is kind of that mentality where it's going to be a long-term effect that you're trying to cultivate. Because a lot of that conversation came about when we were talking about, strength levels when they peak. He was a little bit surprised that people in their 40s and maybe in their 50s can be so strong. And it's like, well, for a lot of these power lifters and bodybuilders, it just takes decades to cultivate that kind of strength and muscle mass. A lot of this stuff doesn't happen over the course of a year to 3 or 5, for that matter.
Well, even going back to the neurological things, it's like if someone is exhibiting a bad technique, I mean, Tiger Woods is a good example right now. He's got a new swing coach, and he's at the time of this recording, he's performing very poorly at this tournament that he's golfing in. But that's to be expected to some degree, and commentators are criticizing how well he's playing, and I'm hoping that Tiger tends to be a pretty optimistic kind of a guy. I think he understands that if he's going to learn this new swing technique, which is going to physically allow him to keep golfing, because that's the genesis of why he wanted to change his technique, was that his back and knees could not tolerate the way he was swinging before. It's going to take time to groove that new pattern, because he is such a he's been playing golf and it's ingrained, so it takes a long time to unlearn and groove a new motor pattern, essentially.
That's very
And you talk about, we've been talking about Olympic lifting in terms of the sequencing of the movements. Like a golf swing is the same kind of thing. It's like you've got a back swing and a forward swing, and you've got to be in the right position to make things work.
You remember, I think a few weeks ago on our Olympic lifting, like how strong do people need to be? We say it was a snatch is like a 300-pound golf swing. I mean, because it is that nuance to it, where it is just a game of inches or millimeters in a lot of times, where if you get off a little bit, start turning your wrist in the swing.
It's not going to work.
Nope, it might work first 100 yards, but after that, it's going it's going into the woods somewhere to the right.
Exactly. Well, I think that's it for today. I mean, any other comments you want to make?
No, I really like those studies. It was very interesting. I like the difference in them. It's not something that I typically do in my day-to-day, so I always like seeing that other aspects of exercise science, because it's such a wide program field of study that we could be pulling from more psychological versus physiological, and all other things in between. So I always like seeing kind of what the other side does. And
well, I want to request for the next podcast we do. I want you to teach me, because I told you when I came into workout, I'm going to be cutting some weight.
Okay.
Start of the new year. That's my goal a little bit is to lean up a little bit.
Okay.
So what I would request from you with your vast nutritional knowledge is I want you to teach me something about about how to appropriately kind of cut weight and try to maintain muscle mass during that cut.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we could do that. No problem. So we'll start off some general principles and get into a few specifics.
That sounds great.
Got it off the top of my head, I think.
I think that'll be appropriate for the new year.
A lot of people are looking to do that sort of thing. Exactly. Yeah, gyms are going to be swelling come January 2nd and then emptying out come February 13th.